Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Non Sequitur Nerds. Tonight, we're going to need you to grab your glam rings and hunt for some owlbears because we're going to be talking fantasy tonight. Something that we haven't really touched on a whole lot. But as always, I'm Tim, joined by Ian. How's it going, buddy?
Pretty good. Yeah, so fantasy is a genre technically touched on a lot in our conversations because I mean
Yeah.
it depending on how you organize fantasy and those kind of things,
Right.
it could cross over into other genres. Um, so it's really there's a lot of going on with fantasy, and it's just one of those things where you kind of have to um, really think about and try to break it down into other genres. So I think we touched on it a lot, but it needs to be something that I think we focus on a little
So,
bit.
before we start, though, we need to, for those of you who are not watching the YouTube feed, our patented You a Bowl counter is now currently at 18 counts. So, we'll be updating you every episode with all the latest You a Bowl news.
Ding!
And I mean,
Uh,
there's not really much news. He makes crappy movies, but we got a thing going. We're gonna roll with it, all right?
right, exactly. So we'll talk fantasy, which is what it's a fantasy when UA Bowl makes a movie
Oh,
for it that's not a Razzie.
there we go.
So yeah, so I think we'll kind of kick things off. Fantasy itself, to me, really kind of spans multiple genres.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a
Yeah.
bunch of sub genres and things like that. You could, depending on what kind of a person are, you could be like, well, sci-fi is also, um,
Yeah, people could
which in
consider sci-fi
reality,
and it definitely shares aspects and similarities with it. Um,
hmm
and I mean, there are times like you and I were talking a little bit before the show about how like you brought up Hellboy as an example, which I think is a good place to start. Um, Definitely draws like some fantasy elements to it because I mean like you do deal with like the occult and ghosts and demons and goblins and all all that kind of stuff, but it also definitely borrows from like a science fiction aspect to it or even a
steampunk.
yeah, steampunk was the other thing he made. I mean, heck, if you look at just looking at the Hellboy movies, his first enemy was Rasputin, the guy who he used magic to do various things. There's your fantasy element right there. It doesn't necessarily
hmm
have to be medieval, set in a castle with elves and trolls and orcs and stuff like that. Not everything has to be Lord of the Rings. Which don't get me wrong, I love Lord of the Rings. I think it is it is definitely a strong foundation for that kind of
hmm
setting, but it's not the end all be all.
Right. I think Lord of the Rings definitely sparked some passion and allowed people to kind of branch out and enjoy that kind of fantasy. And
Right.
it was a good baseline for like an epic fantasy adventure
Oh,
type thing.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I
Um,
mean, and like, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, that's ultimately that's what Lord of the Rings was a story about a journey. Yes, there was fighting. Yes, there was conflict, but ultimately, it's a story about getting from A to B, the long
right.
way.
Right. Or unless you're Randall Graves, in which case then it's 8 hours of watching people walk.
I mean, like to be fair, the movies kind of were a lot of walking, but
I mean that's the whole shtick though, is
well,
like
yeah,
they're
it was.
walking to, like you can't fly into Mordor.
Well, I mean,
Didn't they take the eagles to get there? But
I
you know,
mean,
yeah,
they're taking the hobbits to Isengard.
right, exactly.
I actually
At least take
watched that old video like a day or two ago.
the
They're taking the
nice.
hobbits to Isengard.
Yeah. So yeah, but Hellboy, like we said, is a good um kind of modern fantasy, what I would consider a modern urban fantasy. Sorry,
Yeah,
the
urban fantasy. I
urban
think is the good.
urban fantasy is a good name for it. It's a set in an urban fantasy.
Mm.
It has mysticism elements to it. It has steampunk elements to it, and it has the occult elements to it. Like that's the
It's kind of
whole.
a mixing pot of genres that did a really good like the Hellboy like not just the movies but the comics as well did a really good job of kind of melding all that together and
Mhm.
making it work. It kind of it reminds me. I mean, tangentially reminds me of the Shadowrun tabletop game, which is same thing, a futuristic kind of urban fantasy setting. For those of you who aren't familiar with Shadowrun, effectively think, a futuristic world. Think Cyberpunk 2077 is probably what most people are familiar with these days. But if elves and magic and trolls, orcs, things like that were all commonplace and part of that world. So
Yeah,
futuristic D&D.
isn't there like some aspect of the lore though that's like every 10,000 years or something like that? Like there's some kind of like magic shift and people like they are genetically inherent, like human beings are like the baseline genetic code, and then
Yeah.
like every 10,000 years or something like that, like some magic shift happens and it causes people's innate traits to come out. So like people transform into like dwarves and elves and trolls and stuff.
It's something pretty similar to that. Which fun fact, now that you mentioned that, it was Goblinization Day is what in the lore is known as the day where that stuff started happening. Canonically, that happened like a couple weeks ago in like on our calendar. So everybody was kind of disappointed.
I mean, knowing my luck, I would wind up being like
you'd be a troll
know,
or something.
I'd be a kappa.
I mean, you already got the haircut for it.
True. Well, actually, no. I'd have to get like the bowl, like the bowl cut going around.
There you go.
The kappa's got to have the water in its head.
Oh, that's true. That's true. So you'd literally have a bowl cut.
If it spills the water, then it dries out.
Well, see, there we go. All right, so we've got some Japanese like kind of fantasy folklore going on there, which I know you're a bit more familiar with than I am.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm familiar with some of the main items, but they have yokai. Kind of their like the yokai are kind of their spirits and demon.
They're their catch-all for ghosts almost.
Yeah, catch-all for ghosts and like the different different forms of mysticism and things like that. And they have a ton of really goofy, weird, creepy things.
Yeah, I mean, like yokai, like pretty much if thing A is acting weird, there's a yokai for it. My watch wouldn't turn on. There's a yokai responsible for that. I couldn't find my car keys.
Did you make that reference specifically because there's a little kid show called Yokai Watch?
I didn't, but I'm glad that worked. But I mean that's kind of how it is. Couldn't find my car keys. There's a yokai responsible for that, and that's specifically like that particular kind of creature is responsible for that particular happenstance, which is really neat because I mean, like if you look at like Western fantasy. I mean, yeah, like there's spirit, like there's fire spirits, there's water spirits, there's things like that, but we don't really have, in my opinion anyway, we don't really have that much in depth, like myths. I know we're delving more into mythology now, but we don't really have a whole lot of that here in the States. I think it's a lot of we're a younger country than Japan is by quite a bit.
Well, yeah, I mean,
we don't have that folklore.
Well, we don't. I mean, we have some. Like, if we want to take, so there are definitely regionalized bits of folklore, and again, we're divulging, but that's that's the title of this podcast.
Exactly.
So if you're not used to it by now, whatever.
Anyway. If this is your first episode, we get off topic a lot, but there's a reason. But, I mean, there's a reason.
America has its own. We have some elements of folklore.
Yeah.
We have things like Sasquatch and Bigfoot. And the Jersey Devil, and we're really more talking about cryptids now. But
so we still got on the cryptid talk,
right? And Chupacabra, kinda.
Right. Well, I mean,
the Mothman. The Mothman is another one from out in the Appalachian Mountain type thing.
We have not even cryptids. I mean, we've also got like all the American tall tales. Johnny Appleseed. Paul Bunyan and Babe the Big Blue Ox, John Henry, I mean, we have those stories, but it's not really what I would consider, like, none of those are really what I would consider fantasy so much as, I didn't even want to say fairy tales. I mean, it's folklore is what it is.
Yeah, they're folklore, and, I can't remember the name of the cowboy that would rope the tornadoes and ride them.
Was it Pecos Bill?
Maybe? That sounds right.
Maybe. I know. He was a folklore character. I don't remember specifically what he did. So.
Right. But I mean, our country is a little. United States is a little too young, to really have like these long-lived folklore tales, tales and things like that. I mean, it takes a kind of a long-lived culture to be able to craft some of these things. We're talking about we were just talking about like yokai and the Japanese yokai. They have, you know, that country and that civilization has been around for thousands of years at this point. So, when you look at, some of their and a lot of times like these creatures and folklore and things like that, they're based around like real creatures like the tanuki. Tanukis are mischievous raccoons is really, they're kitsune are foxes, fox spirits,
Right.
Those kind of things.
Well, it's
So
interesting. Like a lot of these things, a lot of like mythology and things and fantasy stuff. There's like if you okay, dragons are a great example. There are like you can tell an Asian style dragon versus a Arthurian dragon. Like if you showed somebody a picture and you said which one of the
European dragon.
Thank you. Like if you showed somebody a picture of each of those side by side and you said, okay, which one of these would you see a knight fighting? They'd be able to pick out the European one, 9 times out of 10, but they'd be able to identify. Oh well, that one's that's a Chinese dragon or a Japanese dragon, or most people don't know the difference, but.
Right.
But it's interesting how like so many different cultures have very similar things. Like okay, you again we're going back to cryptids, but you brought up Bigfoot earlier. There's Bigfoot, there's the skunk ape, there's the Sasquatch, there's the Yeti. All things that are all pretty much the same thing, a giant ape kind of man, found through all. I mean, most of those are. America has a fascination with ape men. That's all I'm gonna say. But I mean, you've got the Yeti out in Tibet.
People that live in Virginia.
Oh, I'm pretty sure my mom was married to one.
Yeah,
but
that's why I'm allowed to say.
Exactly. But no, it's interesting how like a lot of these fantasy elements aren't locked. I mean, there are some that are very specific to a certain culture. Like again, we keep going back to yokai, but yokai is very much a Japanese centric thing. You don't really see American yokai or European yokai. But if you break down like individual ones, like again dragons, it's kind of a universal thing that most countries of any kind of age have folklore and fairy tales about creatures that are pretty similar to one another.
Yeah, and it does kind of make you raise an eyebrow at how did they get? I mean, obviously word travels.
Well, word travels,
as
but
people branch out and the people trade and you start trading. For all of the awful on, he at least spread some of the culture around like these different the different worlds that he lived in. So I'm sure there's some elements of culture that traveled with him,
right?
With the places that he conquered and things like that. Same, like Alexander the Great and the Romans and all those people. They're spreading out this culture,
right?
So you start getting some of that stuff. But
well, and you brought up the Romans. That kind of makes me think about like if you look at like again delving into more mythology than fantasy at this point. But if you look at like the Roman pantheon and the Greek pantheon, pretty much you can lay those side by side and go, all right, this god is this god, this god is this god, this god is this god. They're pretty much interchangeable.
Yeah.
And I mean, so I mean, again, it goes back to like those. A lot of these stories. I mean, it makes you think that a lot of these, not even necessarily godlike pantheons, but even just fantasy stories in general or ideas of this kind of genre, they all have to stem back from one common source, and is people traveled the land, stories got retold orally before there was any kind of written language, things got changed. So like there may have been
it's a giant multi-generational telephone.
Exactly. I mean, and it's like that kind of thing. Now we're going into history here. That has always interested me. How if you look at like stories that have been told through the ages that we still know today, if you go back a little bit farther in history, you see a version of it that's slightly different. Maybe some names have changed, locations have changed. You go back farther, you see it change a little bit more, and it makes you wonder. Like a lot of these, to circle the wagons here back to fantasy, makes you wonder how like the idea of an elf or an orc or magic, where that kind of stuff came from. What was the starting point of that? And it's interesting,
Yeah,
to me, anyway.
and to me, it's a kind of a joke that I've made several times in the past. Not necessarily on the podcast, but I've said it before. It's just like people envision a lot of these things like they dream something. It'll come to them in a dream for some reason, and they're like, "Oh man, that's really amazing." But it kind of it kind of makes me wonder, like, who's the poor guy that like had a nightmare about a bull having a half bull, half human baby? Like,
Right? I mean,
is this the dude that was out in the pasture at night and terrible,
oh,
like, had a terrible nightmare about this? Um,
well,
but
yeah,
yeah,
that.
so we're kind of obviously a little bit off topic a bit,
Yeah.
but circling back to the fantasy element, the fantasy genre. There, like we said, there's a bunch of different fantasy genres, and we were talked about, like urban fantasy. One of my favorite book series is the Dresden Files, which
Right.
is a very much an urban fantasy type thing. It's set in now, like current times, Chicago, the world type place, and it's deals with a modern day wizard. He walks around with a staff. He's got a staff. He's got a blasting rod or a magic wand, as he calls. It's called a blasting rod to him, but he also carries a revolver because he knows better than to. Like,
Sometimes magic missile just don't cut it, and you need a good old Smith and Wesson.
Well, that, and he fights Fae. Like, there are
Oh.
times where he comes in contact with Fae, and traditional Fae, where iron is deadly to fairies, Fae,
Yeah.
the Fae creatures, and so bullets having some modicum of iron and lead in them, that can be deadly, and that things like that to a fairy.
Well, I know our friend Kevin has actually recommended Dresden Files to me, and I've been meaning to pick it up. I just haven't gotten around to it. But like that's one that, like, if you ask a lot of people, what's a good like modern fantasy, like Dresden Files is one that usually is up there on their list.
Yeah.
So it's
And the author Jim Butcher has a few different book series that he's authored. Dresden Files being the longest running and most famous. He has another more traditional one, which is called the Codex Alera. I've not read those.
okay.
And then he has another book series that he started, and I don't know if he's actually released another book. There's at least one out, and I own it. It's called the book itself is called it's like the Aeronaut's Windlass or something like that. It's a
Okay.
steampunk. It's like a steampunk
Ooh.
style book,
Yeah.
and it has like things like airships, and it's part of, I believe, called the Cinderspire Chronicles. I believe is what the series is going to be called, but it follow it's infusion of magic and things like that. They have gauntlets that have like a magic crystal in them that they can use like fire magic bolts and
Oh,
stuff
that's
like
kinda
that.
cool.
Yeah, and like if you shoot them too much, then the gauntlet will over,
Huh.
and like it'll actually like warp and melt because the gauntlet is made of like copper. Like
Okay.
it's it's basically like wound copper. Um, it's wound copper, so like it heats up too much and then it'll start to melt. So it's a really good book series. I love that book series. There's another one series that are kind of off topic, but it's called the Deathgate Cycle,
Okay.
and it's about seven books in the series, and it's kind of like a mix of different genres because it follows these two characters that can travel between worlds using these
Okay.
things called Death Gates.
Okay.
And these are different, like completely different worlds. Like one of them is an aquatic world, another one is like a desert type world. One is more like traditional medieval.
Mhm.
And like people are jumping around in between these worlds, and it's a really cool book series. I would recommend that one as well.
What was that one called again?
I'll double check it and make sure, but I believe it's the Deathgate Cycle. I have it over on my bookshelf. I've got all of them. I read them back in college. I consumed them. I just couldn't stop reading them one after the other.
So I do like that. Seems like it'd be a good series to where it wouldn't get stale being the same thing over and over, because you can change the set, keep the characters that the readers are attached to, but change the setting in which they're in. So that's actually a really neat concept. I like that. Yeah,
There's
that's
another.
pretty cool,
There's
actually.
another. There's another book series that I think you would like. It's called the Coldfire Trilogy.
I've heard of that one, but I'm not super familiar with it.
Yeah, it's C.L. Friedman, I think, or something like that. C.S. Friedman.
Okay.
I can't quite remember. Basically, the premise is that like humanity came to a planet like 100 years ago, like
Okay.
starships and whatnot, but like it looked, for all intents and purposes, it seemed like a normal planet from
Mhm.
space and whatnot. But
Right.
what they didn't realize is that the planet has this energy that will manifest your thoughts or desires.
That could be
So
dangerous.
yes, so like if you have a really deep feeling of like wanting to strand humanity on this planet, then the spaceships will get destroyed. Can get
Huh.
destroyed.
That,
Like
that
if
could
you
be
have
bad.
if you have like a deep feeling of wanting, and it's kind of like using your emotions and things like that to basically make magic, but it follows a couple of main characters. One of them is called the Hunter.
I really,
Um,
really want a cheeseburger right now. Cheeseburger.
it doesn't quite work like that,
Well,
but
I
it could.
want Cheeseburger Planet. Damn it.
Right. Not to be confused with Pizza Planet.
Yeah, we don't mess with the House of Mouse. That's their thing.
Right. Please don't sue me, Disney.
But
Um, so yeah,
that
I mean,
definitely sounds interesting. Like as far as like when it comes to fantasy, like for me, it tends to go three different ways. Traditional like medieval fantasy. I've always been a fan of that. Urban fantasy, just because I like the idea of there being more to this world than what there is, because our world is boring.
right.
And steampunk, just because I love the steampunk aesthetic, the set, just that whole setting. I have always been a fan of.
Well, I
But
mean, you also have. I mean, there's obviously you have Cyberpunk. We referenced
oh,
it
okay,
earlier with the
that's
video
okay.
game. With
So
the video game,
four, I do
yeah,
like cyberpunk setting because I'm a bit of a tech head. So
right, yeah, um, yeah. So different genres and things like that of fantasy, and there's obviously a ton of different books and things like that
yeah.
that you can read. And there's no like right or wrong really
Oh,
to
absolutely.
fantasy. Like find the ones that excuse me, find the ones that you really speak to you.
Well, I mean, I know
'Cause,
it's one that was like super popular a couple years ago, up until the ending anyway. Game of Thrones. I mean, in that
yeah.
like everybody was watching, even people that didn't like that kind of stuff. Typically, everybody was watching it just because it was so. I mean, those first couple episodes. I mean, like if you haven't seen it at this point, I'm pretty sure the statute of spoilers is off. So many people die. They kill off so many main characters in just the first season alone.
Oh, sure.
Like
It's
people
one
are
of
like,
those.
"Oh, this must be the main character." The story's centered around them, and then they die.
Oh, it's very much it's one of those book series, and I kind of like that. It keeps you on your toes, and you don't get to like you can't really fall in love with anybody. Like you can't like
Yeah,
really. You have to almost like disconnect yourself from some of these characters. You can't invest yourself too much in a character
right. You
because
have to love the
you'll be watching.
story, not the characters.
Right, you'll be watching it, and you're like, oh man, yeah, this dude's really awesome.
Yep, there goes his head. There goes his head.
Uh,
But no,
yeah,
I mean,
Tim, you have no idea what it's to invest yourself so heavily in a character to have. I do you?
every freaking anime I watch, this character, oh, they're my favorite. I can relate to them, and oh, they're dead every damn time. Um,
Statute of limitation on some of these is
yeah.
probably long past. So
Uh,
you've got Hughes, you've got Wolfwood. What else?
those are kind of my big two.
Those,
Kamina from Gurren
yeah, I
Lagann
was just gonna say Kamina.
every
That one was
time.
definitely kind of out of nowhere too.
Well, I mean, because like okay, I know we're again off topic. Like they built Kamina up to be like the kind of guy where literally his confidence would put him through anything. Ah,
Except for a glaive to the stomach.
yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, like Game of Thrones kind of followed that trope of killing off the main character and took it to an extreme.
Well, there really wasn't a main character after all. Like for the
After a
first
while,
several seasons.
well, yeah, because
For
they kept
the first several
killing
seasons,
them.
yeah. Well, yeah, and that's what I mean. Is like they're technically, if you want to use like Game of Thrones, the problem with the later seasons was plot armor. Like
Yeah.
it got to the point where like, well, one the only character left.
Oh, you kind of cut off. There.
So
What was that?
I said the only characters that were left were the ones that had to. stories. They just had this massive plot armor around them.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
a lot of people, I mean, we won't get too in depth into the ending because I think that's kind of a beaten horse at this point, but a lot of people were very unhappy with the way the show ended. I'm not even sure if the final book even has the final book even came out yet. Because like Game of Thrones started after the books were started, but ended before the books were finished, which is kind of that you don't typically do that in a book to show or book to movie adaptation. It's usually the source material is done, so they had to kind of just they were given some rough notes from George R.R. Martin, and because he didn't want the ending to be spoiled of how the books were, so he gave them some rough notes, and they just kind of went with what they had, and yeah. But moving on, I mean, I know George R.R. Martin is a popular name, but another R.R. is J.R.R. Tolkien, which I know a lot of people. Lord of the Rings, we touched on this at the top of the show. Lord of the Rings, like I think that's the prime example of fantasy, like medieval fantasy, because I mean it has all the high notes like I had mentioned earlier. You've got your elves, there's castles, there's magic. I mean, and even go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we can qualify this a little bit and say it is medieval fantasy. It can also be you could break that down into like Arthurian fantasy. That's like Knights of the Round Table types. More grounded type fantasy, like still there may be like ghosts or demons and those kind of things, but
I mean you had Merlin, you had Morgan Le Fay. I mean there's magic in those stories, but I do agree with you. I mean they're set. I mean obviously those legends are supposedly historical events, but I mean realistically they're historical events that have been embellished a bit. I mean, I don't think, the Lady of the Lake really, brought a sword and, everybody just went, oh yeah, he's king. That's how it works.
Right. With held forth Excalibur with her
I didn't vote for you.
In the most simmering Semite.
But I didn't vote for you.
Don't vote for a king.
Well, maybe I can be king then. No, I mean, Monty Python, thank you, folks.
Yes.
But yeah, like the Arthurian legends definitely are more grounded. I mean, there is still that fantasy element to them, again, like the things you'd mentioned. But yeah, both, I would definitely consider both the Arthurian legends and Lord of the Rings are definitely medieval. I mean, I know medieval's more of a time period, but if I was to classify them as medieval fantasy genre.
Lord of the Rings, I would say, is very much a traditional fantasy type thing.
Traditional fantasy, that's a much better description.
Yeah, traditional fantasy, they have, like you said, elves. They've got magic. They've got hobbits, halflings.
Yep.
They've got humans and Oliphants and all of those other fantasy-esque critters and things like that. And it's kind of interesting because like if you think about like a Tolkien orc, dark-skinned, fangs,
right?
Beget of elves, like because that's
the
what
Uruk-hai.
they were. Right. Well, I mean, the Uruk-hai are half human, half.
Oh yeah.
Orcs were twisted versions of elves, which is why elves hate them so much.
Yeah. They are everything an elf is not.
Right. Well, it's just like in Tolkien lore, trolls are twisted versions of Ents, like the tree people. Which is why they turn to stone why trolls turn to stones, because they're kind of like the opposite of events and things like that.
There we go.
Anyway, but where was I going with this? Just like a butterfly, it flitted away from me. But sorry, now I remember. Orcs, the Tolkien orcs can be vastly different than like, some other types of orcs. Because when in other fantasy, considered like pigmen.
Right.
Right.
So
they're more.
Would you say that
they're more porcine and?
Would you say that the Tolkien orcs are your token orcs?
Yes, they could be.
Sorry, that's my bad joke. I'm sorry. I'm out.
Yo, pass me the halfling.
But no, I mean, it's kind of counterpoint to what I had said earlier. Like you see the stories, like if you see a story with an orc in it, they can be vastly different. I mean, you've got everything from Tolkien orcs to like Warcraft style orcs, which are like these big, like even bigger, more muscular guys, or like I said, you've got like little pig men. So I mean, they're all orc, but different things.
Orc.
Exactly. Well, I mean, even if you look at elves, I mean, some fantasy stories, elves are immortal. Other fantasy stories, well, no, they live a really long time. Others, they're just people that have pointy ears that are just innately good with magic that live a normal human lifespan. It depends on the setting. But it's interesting how so much of that can be adapted and changed up to fit, the story,
Right.
but still kind of keep that same kind of spark of imagination.
So would you say that orcs are they're those who hunt elves?
Those who hunt elves are something entirely different. Why did we not talk about that in our anime episode?
That's a good question, because that was such a screwball classic.
Oh yeah.
Just so
Well, I mean, even there,
dumb.
Anime inspired by fairy tales and folklore. I mean,
Oh yeah.
heck, there's an anime many of you are probably familiar with called Fairy Tale that deals a lot with magic and dragons and stuff of that nature. I mean, so
Right.
it's the fantasy genre is something that I think has permeated just about every, like, you find some form of media and there's a fantasy thing. I mean, you've got fantasy games. You've got Diablo, Baldur's Gate, Dark Alliance that's coming out soon. I mean, movies. Again, Lord of the Rings. We talked on that one. Comics. There was a comic series that I used to really love called ElfQuest. That was, yeah. I mean, it was like, I love the art style in it. That was effectively about a tribe of elves and the adventures that they had. Super simplification. I mean, we mentioned there's anime that goes over it. I mean, fantasy is something
Cartoons.
Cartoons.
I mean, look at Gargoyle, like Disney's Gargoyle.
Oh, Gargoyle.
I mean, it's
Ooh.
very. That one was a very cool mix of traditional fantasy and urban fantasy.
Oh yeah.
And
Well,
it also
they
mixed
literally
in
took
some.
those
It also
characters.
mixed in some. Right. It also mixed in some cyberpunk elements.
A little, yeah, because
Um,
they had the robotic gargoyles.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, it's some. I think it's a lot of that. I think, in my opinion, anyway, I like fantasy because a lot of the times it's so different from our normal mundane day to day lives that it's that I use this phrase again. It's that spark of imagination of, well, what if there were wizards? What if my next door neighbor was an elf? So what if I got I mean, I forgot where I was going with that, but let's talk about that time I got reincarnated as a slime. That was a great time.
Right.
Again, another
my
fantasy
babysitter's
anime.
my babysitter's a vampire.
Right.
Yeah, there's there. Fantasy is a nice escape.
Oh, absolutely.
I wouldn't even really say it's an escape. Like, it's a good way to kind of remove yourself. Yeah, that's kind of why I play like video games.
Yeah.
It's a good way to experience a world that, as far as I know, I'm never going to experience outside
Right.
of my computer screen. But it sparks those kind of like joys and things like that. And people, there's other people that get joy out of history,
Yeah.
newspaper, or more like political dramas and those kind of things.
Yeah.
Stuff that's more relatively grounded in reality.
You know what I want to see? I want to see a TV show that's a political drama with a fantasy setting to it. President Orkman.
There you go. Didn't we just get rid of him?
Moving on. I'm fairly certain that most of our listeners would probably agree, but
Yes.
but no, it's I mean, I think that would be like a series with like political intrigue, where like the vice president is a an elf who's trying to resurrect some kind of ancient evil to take over as the president.
Right. Yeah.
That would be interesting to watch, actually, because it's two genres that you wouldn't think would mix well together, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, I'd watch that. I'd give it I'd give it a watch.
Yeah, exactly. President Nebuchadnezzar, what have I told you about you?
Senator Caliburn, we have reason to believe that you were formerly a necromancer. Do you have any comment on this, sir?
Latuverata Nictu!
Well, you just like knocked. You did that, and like 5 things fell off my desk. So, Ian's a sorcerer. You all saw it. You all heard it. But wow, boo boo weep.
Right.
So okay, so let me ask you, medieval fantasy or urban fantasy? Which kind of do you gravitate more towards?
I think more nowadays, like as an adult, I'm gravitating more towards urban fantasy because to me it's almost a realistic or a built around. There's some level of realism around it, even though
Yeah.
I know that there's not a wizard walking down the street.
There might be.
The old man walking down the street is not actually a wizard. That's not like his blasting staff. It's just a cane.
He just can't. He just needs a cane.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it's fun to imagine those kind of things.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's why things like the Dresden Files really speak to me, is because it's that urban fantasy. There's some realism to it, and it's also kind of got these darker elements to it, because like in that series, magic is not known to non-magical people. Like,
right. Really? Okay.
Like normal people don't know about magic and these creatures and the things that go bump in the night.
Mhm.
So like it's very much a clandestine, like hidden element to society. Like normies wouldn't know about it. So it's kind of sometimes fun to just think that
right.
maybe Jim Butcher, like he's
You cut
writing.
out, all I heard was maybe Jim Butcher. Silence.
Oh, sorry. Maybe Jim Butcher really is a wizard.
There you go. I mean,
Autobiographical, tongue-in-cheek type thing. Like there really is a seedy magical underbelly. So when I can't find my car keys or something, because a pixie came by and hid them somewhere.
It almost, like the way you're describing it, almost seems like a grown-up version of Harry Potter, where it's a magical world that non-magical folks don't know about. There's an underbelly to it, but it seems like a grown-ups version of like Harry Potter PI.
Yeah, kinda. I mean,
Okay.
it really kind of is something similar, and it's definitely an adult version because it takes things where a logical thinking adult would take him.
Okay.
What I mean that being like I said, Harry carries a gun because
Harry does.
No, that Harry Dresden. That's his name. Is Harry. His name. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, because you said Harry carries a gun, and I'm like, Expecto Patronum, spoof.
No. And that maybe also be part of it as well. But yeah, the main character's name is Dresden.
Harry Dresden. Okay.
Yes.
That's kind of funny.
So
actually.
yeah, he carries a gun. But it's one of a good friend of mine, Cody, said many times that Harry Potter fenced it because if he was in that universe, he would just get like a 357 or not 357, like a 30-06 long rifle and take out Voldemort building from a mile away.
I mean,
good luck casting your Adabra Cadaver with
Adabra Cadaver.
Yeah, Adabra Cadaver or whatever it is.
Abracadabra.
The spell that kills people.
Avada Kedavra.
Yeah, whatever.
You're have a cadaver.
In a Gata Davida.
That's a spell that we don't talk about. All right.
Right. And so, yeah, it's that world doesn't make a lot of sense because like people aren't walking around with like magic shields around themselves at times. You very much, what the hell stops Harry from showing up to his duel with 38 and just smoking him?
I mean, that's
very much kind of like that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where the swordsman comes out swinging the blades, and then Indy just like takes out his pistol and shoots.
So that scene was actually improv.
It technically was, but wasn't. There was supposed to be a very involved sword fight, like battle between the two of them.
Yep.
But Harrison Ford, I believe, had food poisoning or something like that, and he had the.
And he didn't want to deal with it.
Right. He couldn't do the scene, and so then they were like, kind of makes sense that like Indy would just shoot him. Like,
Yep.
that's very in character for Indy. So that's how. And if you go back and watch the scene, like you can see Harrison Ford just looks ragged, like he's sweating,
Yep.
like he does not look like he's in a good position. Pop, and done.
It works.
So, point being though is like you have that urban adult fantasy. So
I think the point being is that Harrison Ford always shoots first, and I will die on that hill.
McClunky.
McClunky. But no, I mean that definitely does sound interesting because it is, and I think it's easier for people to relate to an urban fantasy setting, especially if it's set in our world, because it's easier to imagine a guy walking down the street in Chicago at night than it is to imagine the far off land of Telfada. It's like,
right.
I mean, because it really it's that kind of show. I'm trying to think how to word this. It shows a certain level of aptitude by the writer. Like anybody can say, "Oh, downtown Chicago," and most people have a pretty good idea of what downtown Chicago looks like. But some random fantasy land, you really need to have a lot of world building and be very descriptive of how it looks. Because you and I could read a passage from the same fantasy novel and have entirely different views on how this castle they're walking into looks, even if we're given the same description. So I mean, I think it's I don't want to say people are lazy, but it is easier to imagine those fantasy worlds that are set in our real world setting than it is to imagine those far off places. But that's not saying that any of those, like Middle Earth. I keep going back to Lord of the Rings. That's one of my favorite medieval fantasies. Tolkien did it's sometimes almost too elaborate of a job of describing things. Well, I mean, heck, if you go back, have you ever read the Silmarillion?
Yeah, I have.
Okay, it's that like, I had to push myself to get through that because some of the things are overly described in that. And for those of you that aren't as familiar with the Silmarillion, it's effectively, it starts off with the creation myth of Middle Earth, and goes from there. I mean, it is very in depth on how everything is the way it is, starting from the point of creation, and it reads like I don't want to say religious manuscript.
I mean, it's the Tolkien version of Genesis.
I mean, effectively, yes. So I mean, it does kind of read like a religious manuscript.
Yeah, but, no, I mean it's very descriptive, and it's very difficult to get through simply because like it covers the first 3 eras. Like
it covers a very long time.
Yeah, I mean it covers all the way up until really the start of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Like with the forging of even actually it covers like the Isildur and the first defeat of Sauron.
Yep.
And whatnot, and it like that's several millennia.
Yeah,
in the Lord of the Rings universe. And there's something that it kind of just sparked in my mind, like we think about something in our world, like our technological advances and things like the speed of advancement of technology has just been explosive over the last 20 years.
Oh, absolutely.
Even 50 years. Like 50 years ago, a computer was the size of my house.
Yeah, I mean almost.
And, yeah, I mean that was and that had, as much memory as
that calculator over there. I mean,
right, it had as much memory in it as the Apple mouse that sits over on my work computer.
Right.
If not, actually, my mouse probably has more memory.
I mean, this single flash drive right here could have held all the files necessary to send a man to the moon in the 60s and still had space.
Right. So, but there's a I think it's a trope, or I don't really know. It's something that's kind of unexplored in fantasy to me, is that, and I think it's a crux type thing where magic is almost used as like a crutch and actually a hindrance to advancement. Because you think about like the civilizations in Lord of the Rings and whatnot that have magic and have some kind of magical involvement, elves and things like.
Yeah.
these civilizations are older than humanity is now, and they're no more advanced
The Middle Ages.
than humanity was in the Middle Ages. Like they don't have guns. They don't even I don't even think crossbows, right? They
Maybe. Well, I mean, I know they had ballistas and whatnot, which is
well, they definitely had trebuchets
yeah,
and they had
trebuchets.
catapults,
Yeah,
but I don't
I
remember
don't
if
know if
they
they.
had
I
ballista.
don't remember seeing a crossbow, but I get what you're saying. Well, I mean, it's you know, that reminds me of a kind of humorous scene in the Harry Potter, where Harry's there at the Weasley's house. You know, they're all talking, having a good time, and Papa Weasley looks at Harry and says, "Harry, you've lived with Muggles. What is the purpose of a rubber duck?" And like something that like rubber ducks have been around for a long time. I mean, they would have been around when he was a kid. And something even as simple as that, the concept of it escapes him. Of
Yeah.
what is this used for? I mean, it is kind of interesting that any of the, I mean, it kind of goes both ways. Both like because it always seems like a medieval fantasy. If there's magic, you know, there's the kingdom that has lasted 10,000 years, but they're no more advanced in the Middle Ages. Vice versa, if you look at fantasy stuff that's done in today, it almost seems like there's times where, well, like okay, good example, the Vampire the Masquerade tabletop. You know, vampires all consider fantasy. Um, the older editions of it, they didn't have to worry about cell phones with cameras on them. They didn't have to worry about dash cams. They didn't have to worry about webcams and wireless cameras, stuff like that everywhere. They actually had to when they put out the new version of it, they actually had to revise that and talk about the fact that everybody almost these days has a cell phone with a high definition camera on it.
Yep.
So if a vampire like takes somebody down an alley, there's going to be 10 people going, "I'm going to send this to World Star" and recording it. So like it's interesting to see how fantasy genres have had to almost adapt to things
Right.
like that. You know?
But I'm going to draw the same correlation there that I did a moment ago
Okay.
with Dresden Files and things like that. That Vampire the Masquerade, it's in the title, right? Masquerade.
Yeah.
The technology or the magic society is a hidden society.
Yeah.
It is not front and center in the world.
Yes.
So the rest of the world has continued to advance because they don't have magic as a crutch. They don't have magic to rely on. And that's kind of where like some steampunk or like arcane punk is another genre as well that like mixes magic
Yeah.
and technology well. And that's where I think they kind of do that. But if even in those cases you notice like their level of advancement of technology is still much slower.
Yeah.
Like steampunk is obviously they rely on steam power, gears and mechanics. Like they don't have semiconductors and things like that. They
Right.
rely on like physical clockwork mechanism. And so like it always seems like in the fantasy genre, magic is a crutch that actually hinders advance because everybody is just so all they want to focus their attention on is how they can develop, you know, the next version of magic missile that can take out more targets
Right.
versus, you know,
A gun.
why do you need, why do you need to have a pay a dude down the street to cast a magic spell to heal you type thing. So like
Right.
they're, and I think that's something that happens in a lot of isekai anime where, like a character gets, a modern person gets pulled into another world that's usually like a medieval world,
Usually.
and
Yeah.
then they wind up having like all of these crazy ideas about like modern technology and things like that. And there's actually an anime series that's on Crunchyroll. It's called The Ascendance of a Bookworm. I highly suggest you watch it.
Okay.
It follows this bookworm girl, like she was a huge book nut.
All right.
She died in her life, like in our world, and her soul was transported to this other world, and she inhabits the body of like this 4-year-old kid.
Okay.
Actually, she's like 5 or 6, but basically, it's one of those things where it's very heavily implied that the girl whose body she inhabits was very sick and she actually died,
Oh.
and so then her soul like
Kind of swooped
inhabited the body in her place, and she kind of inherited like some of her memories and things like. So it wasn't
Okay.
like it wasn't like Wonder Woman 84 where like Trevor's soul took over another dude's body and then raped him. Because that's what happened.
I mean, yeah, like the original dude could not consent to that, so
Correct. And it
yeah,
only looked like Trevor to her. He looked like the other dude to everyone else. So
yeah,
anyway, but she's like this very
yeah.
bookishly like ridiculously smart character
Okay.
in like now inhabiting a 6-year-old, and so like she's coming up with all of these things that this medieval society doesn't have, like shampoo. She
You know, it's the
invents
little things like
shampoo.
that you don't think about.
Right. No, she invents shampoo. This world and the whole binding of this, which is no pun intended because we're talking about a bookworm.
Right.
The entire binding and the core of this show is that she wants to read,
Hmm.
but books are not available because she's like she's a peasant.
Right.
Like books are only available to like the church and the ultra rich.
Oh,
So
yeah.
she's like spends the first half of the show, like the first 13 episodes, trying to figure out a way to make paper, so that she could
Oh,
write her own
wow.
book
Huh.
because paper is not readily available. And but she creates all of these other things in the process of getting to paper. So it's a really interesting, really well done because it also talks about like, economics and socioeconomic status. And there is a fantasy element to it, and there is magic in this world,
Mhm.
but it is very very rare.
Mhm.
It's like sparsely like it's very sparse, and the people that can do it are basically just like members of the church type thing.
Okay. Interesting.
So it's a really good show, and it handles like that isekai fantasy genre well, and it really I wouldn't say it turns it on its head, but it definitely approaches
It's
it from a
interesting. Yeah, it's a different
different.
spin. Yeah.
Yeah, like it's not like, oh, I was summoned to another world. No, I died, and like now I'm living in a 2-bedroom apartment as a pauper.
Right. Well, I mean, it seems like a lot of isekai are. I'm in a world with magic. Cool. Let's see what I can do. And this is very much a. I'm in a world that sucks. This sucks. Everything about this sucks. Why am I here?
Right. Yeah, I mean it's not nearly that. It's not that dour, but it's
Okay.
definitely one of those things. But um, going back to my very original point, which was magic hinders technological advancement in these societies because it is used. And I feel like that is something that isn't explored enough in the genre. You might have something like Arcane that talks about like technology and magic, but
Yeah.
they're usually against each other. They're conflicting forces,
Right.
not something that is intertwined and like melding of the forces. Like it's
Well, I mean,
usually technology versus magic because magic is very arcane and unstable and
right.
super powerful, but it's really difficult. So,
Well, I know that there's been a couple Final Fantasy games, particularly the older one. Well, I mean, some of the newer ones too, where it's been very much a magic versus technology. I mean, like even Final Fantasy VII is very much the progression of technology, the progression of human engineering versus the literal energy of the planet.
right.
I mean, so I mean, it's they're having other. Yeah, it seems like whenever there's a substantial technology and substantial magic, they always butt heads. There's never a. There have been a few things that have done a good melding of the two. Um, like I think
Right.
Shadowrun's done a pretty good job of it because again in that setting, when that stuff first happened, nobody knew what to do. But now as time went on past that in their timeline, magic and mystical things are so commonplace that it's no different than me walking down to the corner store to pick up some nails at the hardware store downtown would be no different in that setting than me walking down the street to hire a mage to polymorph me a new deck, which I wish it was that easy. Um,
Right.
but yeah,
I'm gonna play devil's advocate and kind of
okay.
counter that again. That in the setting of Shadowrun,
Mm.
it wasn't magic wasn't there for the advancement of the human
That's
the
true.
human race.
That's true.
Magic and mysticism came
Came
in
after.
after. I mean, because again, you said it was what, 2 weeks ago was
It was,
when
it was maybe
the,
maybe a month ago.
the goblinizing day,
Yeah.
goblinization day, or something like that.
Yeah. But
Um,
the counterpoint is after all that has happened, a lot of magic was used in that world to further advance stuff beyond what it normally would have, what normally would have been just through purely technological means. So
right. No,
yeah,
I'm not in disagreement that's to me the correct way to go with it.
yeah,
The problem is just that when magic is there first, technology doesn't advance. When magic
that's
comes
yeah,
after advancement, after technology, then it moves on. And one of the things with Dresden is they like it's kind of has that arcane punk where they're like butting, magic kind of butts heads,
yeah,
because in that world, magical beings, like with even wizards,
yeah.
have an adverse effect on technology. Harry can't own a cell phone because it burns out in his presence.
Huh.
Like it'll fizzle out and explode.
That's kind of neat actually.
Like there's several instances where he will focus his willpower on like a camera,
It just shorts out.
and
Huh.
it's yeah, and it's not he's not like using magic against it. He's just like focusing his energy on it, and the magical energy of these creatures screws with technology.
Huh.
So
Interesting.
like
That's a weird neat way to
basically,
do it.
yeah, basically like he can own a television, but it has to be like a 1950s tube, like a radio tube television.
Yeah, yeah.
It can't be anything newer than like the 60s because it burns out the tech.
That's kind of neat actually.
Yeah. So
So he could
it's
he could
interesting.
have a rotary phone then.
He could have a rotary phone, yeah. I
Huh.
mean, you could even have like he could even probably have just a normal like desk phone, but
Right.
like it'd have to be like an older style phone, like
Not like a
not
cordless
like,
phone even.
yeah, not like a cordless phone that's got like digital components in it or something. Like it
This
has to be like an old copper wire phone.
That's a really interesting way to do it though. That again, it goes back to the magic and technology butting heads, but it's interesting to see how it's a different way of doing it than what a lot of other things in that genre have done.
Yeah.
Interesting. Huh. I'm definitely going to
Yeah.
give that a read.
Yeah, I highly suggest it. If you don't pick up the books, remind me next time I see you because I have almost all of them at this point. So
Okay. Definitely have to check that
um,
out then.
yeah, it's a good one. So, but yeah, the fantasy genres are there. I mean, there are so many different subgenres
Yes, sir.
genres of fantasy. Like I was looking at a website, 50 like 50 fantasy subgenres.
Oh, you
Okay,
you cut out again.
damn it.
You're having trouble tonight, bud. You're riding the struggle bus over there.
Apparently, yeah. Sorry, I was reading the website and it was, 50 fantasy subgenre. The hell? Okay.
It happened again.
Apparently, it just doesn't like when I say certain. So that's fun.
So there's 50 fun fantasy subgenres. I think is along the lines of what you're trying to say.
Yes.
But yeah, it's. We've only touched on a couple tonight, but the fantasy genre, again, since a lot of it is based on stories that have been told, for hundreds of years now. It's kind of gotten into everything. Um, it's kind of fun that it's like fantasy, magic, all that stuff. It's I like the fact that all that stuff is so endearing, and we're still getting new stories told in that kind of setting. Because I've always kind of, obviously, like if you folks haven't listened up to this point, I like Dungeons and Dragons. I like, Shadowrun. I like Pathfinder. I like a lot of magic fantasy type stuff, and it's always been, ever since I was a little kid, it's always been something that I've really enjoyed. Um, well, did you see? If we're talking about modern stuff, what was that Will Smith movie?
Light.
Bright,
Bright.
Bright. Bright,
Yeah.
I thought was phenomenal because it did a really good job of showing how that kind of world would work in a modern setting. So I mean, there is still magic, but it's not in the way that you would typically think in those kind of settings. I mean, you've got, his partner is an was an orc, right?
Yeah.
Which I mean, I don't know that actor's name on the top of my head, but they did a phenomenal job. Um, so it's I've always enjoyed it. Is kind of the long and short of it. I mean, I don't need to really stretch out words on that one. It's something that I enjoy.
I think you and I are in the same boat. Like we both have enjoyed. To me, it was kind of like a bit of an escape and whatnot to the
Yeah.
the real world. Both grew up in the middle of BFE nowhere.
Yeah.
So what else were we gonna do? We were go out in the field and watch the cows.
Or we can imagine the corn wizard that lives across the road.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean yeah, the children from the corn.
I mean, the Amish grow beards, so it really wasn't hard to imagine a wizard living across the road from me. I mean, they have
True.
signature hats and long beards, so maybe the Amish are wizards and we just don't know it.
Right, and they don't believe in zippers, so
It's magic.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So fantasy is.
I can't not imagine an Amish wizard now. I'm sorry. I mean, think of some of the names they have. Malachi, Zebediah.
Nebuchadnezzar?
Nebuchadnezzar, Elminster Miller. No, I don't. I'm not meaning to rip on the Amish, but it's like
I am.
it's fun to just think, like, well, okay, what if my Amish neighbor was a wizard, Because it's
kind of
it's so much better
hard.
than the normal mundane of no, he just gets up at 5 in the morning to milk his cows.
Right, he just doesn't believe in technology.
Yeah.
So that's all.
Maybe a wizard.
Could be.
No, like,
but then again, I've never seen a buggy by a Pegasus, so I don't know.
Unless it's some kind of glamour spell.
Maybe that's how the the Phantom Buggy.
Oh,
maybe
the
that's
Phantom
what it
Buggy.
was. The Phantom Buggy was pulled by a Pegasus.
So okay, so to fill you guys in,
he used the glamour and then had the Pegasus get him out of there.
Fly off. Okay, the Phantom Buggy. Years and years and years ago, it was you, I, and it was Kevin, I think.
I think so.
Well, we were all over at my mom's house. This is when we were in high school, and we were going to the local video store to rent movies, rent games, whatever we were doing. Well, the video store.
Back when video stores existed.
Yeah, like I miss that video store because they always had such a good selection. It was a local like mom and pop thing. But anyway, at the time, the road that the video store was on, there were two entrances. Well, two entrances, at either end of a long road that curved very lazily. So we're going down there, and we see the blinking lights of a buggy. Well, the sun was like just setting, so it was starting to get dark. So I slowed down. So I'm like, all right, well, there's a buggy up ahead, and this is a part of the road where there was no way to turn off of it. So I slow down. I'm driving real slow. I lose sight of the lights. Drive even slower. We just kept driving, and the buggy's just gone. This is before we got to the parking lot of the video store, and long before where the exit past the video store would have been. There was no place for this buggy to turn off. There were no entrances to fields. There was no other houses. There was nothing there. The buggy's just gone.
Yeah, it was ditch and woods.
Yeah.
That was it. So yes, that's the Phantom Buggy.
And yeah, to this day we still bring that up because all three of us saw the buggy. There was no place for it to go. So that's my ghost story. Thanks, folks, for joining us tonight.
But actually, on that note, we probably will hang it up for the night. So yeah, fantasy genre has been a lot of fun. Something that has lived within both of our lives for quite a while.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, and it lives on my PC because as I look over, I have Fantasy 14 installed. Not that I've played it, but much lately.
Yeah.
But
we've
still,
been playing
it's there.
other games lately.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So as always, you can find us on all of your favorite.
I'll fill in for Ian because he's cutting out. As always, you can find us on all your favorite social medias. You can find us on Facebook as Non Sequitur Nerds. You can find us on Twitter at Non Sequitur Nerd without an S because the S was too long for Twitter. We have our website, www.nonsequiturnerds.com, that we never update, but hey, we have a website. And you can always find our podcast on most major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. We are hosted by Anchor FM, and you can also find video renditions of all of our episodes available on YouTube under Non Sequitur Nerds. So, assuming Ian will be able to talk here in a second, thanks for joining us, folks, tonight. Like always, I'm Tim.
Nobody can hear me anyway, so.
Hey, there he is. Good night, Ian.
Good night, everybody.